All right, everybody, welcome to my overview of quantitative research, and let's get started. So, many of life's failures are people who did not realize how close they were to success when they gave up. Try to remember this quote as you're working on your dissertation, because sometimes it seems like the end is forever away, but you will get there if you just keep pushing forward. So we're going to start off by talking a little bit about scholarly writing. You need to write so that your reader doesn't need to make any assumptions or figure anything out. You want to make sure that when you're writing that every point you make leads clearly to the next point. There's no gaps in what you're writing. You also want to make sure you're supporting any assertions with in-text citations. Ideally with serial in-text citations at the graduate and doctoral level. You want to present a statement, add advice, and move on to a concrete example to clarify and illuminate your statement. A good way to remember to do this is called the meal plan. So you have a main idea, you have evidence to support that idea, you analyze that idea, and then you link to the next idea. And of course, following APA format and conventions throughout all of what you write. So some things to think about before you start writing. Where do you want your readers to go? What do you want them to understand? How do you want them to get there? What is the logical path of thinking that your readers can follow to understand kind of why you're interested in this and what your thinking is behind it? For a research topic, you need to examine the existing body of knowledge. There's a couple of areas that you have to look at. First, the subject matter, the content. What is the main idea? What do we know about it? What do we not know about it? And then, will you have access to participants? Will you have the resources to collect and analyze the information? Is it within your scope of practice, and is it legal and ethical to do? And then, once you've done all of that, you can also think about how is this topic going to add to the existing literature, and how is it going to support scholars and practitioners and advance professional goals of our profession. When conducting a literature review, you want to make sure you identify the keywords and keep track of those keywords. You'll need to use those to describe your literature review in your chapter 2. You'll want to search the library and public databases. That should be and you should really skim about 50 articles before you really start to narrow things down. The more you research, the better. And then you're going to bring it down to, per theme, 10 to 12 research articles, most likely. One of the biggest errors that I see in lit reviews is using the same source over and over and over, or having one paragraph that focuses on one source, then the next paragraph focuses on the next source. This is called chunking. And at the doctoral level, we're looking for synthesis. So what we really want to see is themes of the literature. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. Make sure that, those things that you're reviewing are not rabbit holes, that they're actually central to what you're doing. It's a really good idea to have some sort of map, either a verbal map like an outline, or it could be a pictorial map to help you understand kind of how everything fits together. Again, focus on themes and then write your lit review. Age does matter. A lot of students will ask me, why can't I use this if it's beyond 10 years? Well, think about it. If data was collected in 2007, then usually there's analysis in a draft publication that can take a year to two. So you're up to 2009, then it's published in 2010. Is it ethical to use that? Well, that research is about 13 years old in 2020. It's going to be, 15 years old if you're in 2022. So you really need to think about how old the data is, not just the article that you're using. You really want to use the most current information. Now, there are always exceptions. If there's a seminal work, like if you're using Erickson, obviously you've got to cite some Erickson. If you're using, Lazarus and Folkman's stress theory, then you need to use their work. But what you need to do is you have to pair that with current research so that you can show that what you're talking about is still relevant in today. So that's where serial citations will come in handy. and kind of talking about that is to think about your studies as like a cocktail party or a cookout or a birthday party that you're having a bunch of friends over to. The goal is not to talk about what each individual person said at the party, but to really summarize what happened at the party. What were the main events of the party, right? And so when you're coming to talk to somebody about your literature, you need to think about it in themes and use those serial citations, which are alphabetized by first author, and make sure that you have a mix of studies, right? You're not just looking all at qualitative, all at quantitative, or all at mixed methods. You want to make sure that you have a mix of different types of studies, that those studies are within the last 10 years, or if they are older, that you support them with more current research. And that you also want a diversity of journal sources and governmental sources of those primary sources, so that you are not relying on secondary sources like textbooks and things like that. Those are a no-go in a lit review. Instead, you need to be looking at the actual literature, the actual research that was conducted. So let's talk about chapter 1. So chapter 1 has all of these components, and we're going to talk about each one of these in order. So, first of all, how do you do your chapter 1? Well, the first thing I will say to you is that I honestly recommend writing your chapter 1 last of chapter 2, 3, and 1. So, the order that I recommend is chapter 2, followed by chapter 3, and then followed by chapter 1. It just seems like when students write chapter 1 first, they end up rewriting it after they've written chapter 2 and 3, so save yourself some time. You'll conduct a research literature review, and you're going to want to create the background of the study. That's really an important component of chapter 1, is creating that background. Why do we care about this? What are the unanswered questions? What do we not know? What are the controversies about the particular area? You're going to introduce the problem, and this is the big world issue. So like if I'm worried about veteran homelessness, I can talk about homelessness, I can talk about veterans, I can talk about the statistical impact of that. And then when I get to my research purpose, it's going to look at a very specific aspect of that. So purpose and problem are very different. So the problem is really kind of the rally call to get everybody really invested in why your topic is so important to know more about. The background of the study is going to be a brief overview of research, identification of key components of your proposed studies, like your variables, a historical overview of the topic, how the problem arose or how it's sustained, and then also the complexity, right? It's going to the length of this is going to really depend on the complexity. You build the research problem. You want to have a hook for your readers. You want it to be easily understood by your readers. You want to identify clearly and articulate clearly what the issues are and why they should care about those. And then you're going to do your rationale for your theoretical orientation. So you've introduced the problem. What's the lens that you're going to use to look at that problem through, right? So if I'm studying stress, then I might use a stress theory like Glasser's and Folkman. If I'm looking at attachment, I'm going to look at Bowlby and Ainsworth, right? So I'm going to look at some reason for why the theory logically flows from the problem or is useful in understanding the problem. The purpose of the study, this is a statement that is a direct response to the problem. The purpose of the study should start out, the purpose of this, and you actually want to say what design the study is to do what? So for example, this one at the bottom, the purpose of this correlational study is to determine the relationship between non-cognitive variables and academic success for traditional age African American freshmen who attend a public PWI versus a public HBCU. This was from my dissertation. You can see I have the design. I also have what I'm looking for, the relationship. I have my independent variables, my dependent variable, and then my delimiters, which we'll talk about all of those items here in a second. Now, the research question really should be a direct reflection of that purpose statement. So in this case, is there a relationship between non-cognitive variables and academic success for traditional age African American freshmen who attend a public PWI versus a public HBCU? Hypothesis, one per independent dependent variable combination and then one combined one. So this is my combined one for my dissertation, or one of them. There is no relationship between the non-cognitive variables and academic success. Now, I also had a hypothesis that looked at each one of the non-cognitive variables in relation to academic success as measured by GPA. I also had another series of questions that looked at academic retention in relation to each one of these as well. Significance of the study is ultimately who cares about it? Like, who's going to benefit from you doing this study and how? The so what, right? Why is the study being conducted? What is the problem we're trying to solve? What's the importance of it? Who's going to benefit from it? How are they going to benefit from it? That's the significance of your study. Definition of terms, it's like a little mini glossary that's in your research. It's in alphabetical order. You can use terms that somebody else, or definitions that others have used, and cite those, of course, or you can create your own. But this is where you're operationalizing the terminology that's going to be used in your study. And for each term, you'll use a level 4 heading followed by the definition. And again, they are in alphabetical order. You really need to focus on defining your variables, so your dependent, your independent variables, any delimiters that might need to be explained. So for example, in my dissertation, what's a non-cognitive variable? What each one of the non-cognitive variables were and how they were defined. What does it mean to be African American? What does it mean to be traditional age? What does it mean to be freshman? What is a PWI? What's an HBCU? So I had to define all that. What's academic success? The assumptions are things that, well, you have to take for granted. So, for example, in my dissertation, I had a self-report instrument called the non-cognitive questionnaire. So I had to assume people were going to fill this out faithfully and really honestly. So what are my methodological assumptions? What are my theoretical assumptions? I was assuming that non-cognitive I had some scholarly support for this too, but I'm assuming that the questionnaire really did measure based off the reliability and validity that I had. It measured what it said it was going to measure. So these were some assumptions that I had. Delimitations are how I'm kind of delimiting or creating boundaries of who can and cannot be in my research study. So, for example, I only examine traditional age African American freshmen enrolled at HBCU or a public PWI in North Carolina. So those were some of the ways that I delimited my research sample. Limitations are things that I know are going to be challenges to my internal validity. So, for example, or even my external validity for generalization, I knew that my sample in my PWI was going to be much, much smaller than my sample in my HBCU. So that was some challenge that I had to overcome and think about and think through, right? Now, chapter 2. So in chapter 2, well, let's go back for a second. When you're writing your dissertation proposal or your dissertation, you need to treat each chapter as if they're absolutely, completely independent of one another. So what that means is that each chapter is going to have to have things restated because they're really considered independent sections. So I'm going to restate my purpose. If I have any acronyms that I've been using, abbreviations, I have to restate all of those as well. You want to be very, very consistent with your language. So do not change the wording that you have throughout your book. You want to stay consistent. So if I'm looking at, say, traditional age freshmen, I'm not going to then say maybe college students or young adults or university students, because all of those things mean slightly different things. So I want to make sure that I am being very consistent, like ad nauseum consistent with my terminology and my language that I'm using in my dissertation. So in chapter 2, we're going to talk about a theoretical framework, the themes from the literature, the rationale for each of the themes and why it's important, and then the relationship between those themes, the research questions, hypothesis, and how those things are studied. So first things first, describe that theoretical. Now you had a brief overview in chapter 1, but this is really where you dig into it and you really make those connections for your reader about how that theory is going to help you understand the phenomena that you're studying. No matter whether it's qualitative or quantitative, you're going to have to really dig into that. Unless, of course, you're doing grounded theory, which would not have its own theory because it's creating theory. So you want to make sure that you really dig into those theoretical constructs, what they are, and how they relate to what you're studying. Then you're going to go into your review of critical literature. You can actually do this first and then your theory, or you can do your theory first and then this. You can do it either way. I recommend 3 to 5 major relevant themes and what we know about those themes, right? And then you're going to conclude by kind of synthesizing that and talking about how what you've learned through your literature review connects to what you're studying. Then you're going to do also a literature review of the research design. So how has this topic been studied in the past? What were the strengths of that methodology, of the methodologies that have been used? What were the weaknesses? So this is where you really look at those recommendations for future research as you're reading those articles for your lit review. You can also be conducting this literature review at the same time and really capturing kind of those strengths and weaknesses and how you're going to make improvements on what's already been done and how that information leads you naturally to the type of research design that you should be using to discover what you're looking at with the phenomenon. Oftentimes students will come kind of fixed on, I'm going to do my research in this way, like qualitatively or quantitatively, or I know I want to do a quasi-experimental. And I will suggest that it's a better approach to kind of suspend that information until you've done this literature and let the literature guide you naturally. And that way you're not fighting against the literature. Some considerations, make sure you place things within a historical context, right? You need to really have a diversity of sources and ideas. You want to show the things that support your, process and your proposed process as much as those that don't, because then you're showing a fair review of the literature. You're really laying that foundation and really clarifying the research issue and how the study is going to help solve that problem, or at least a part of it. Chapter 3, methodology. Again, remember, new chapter, have to restate everything, have to reintroduce all your acronyms and all of that. So you restate the purpose, don't change it. Say it the same way it was said in chapter 1 and chapter 2. So research design is what chapter 2 or chapter 3 is all about. It's all about your methodology. So you're going to talk about the design, how the design is going to help the questions, what the questions are, what the hypotheses are if you're doing quantitative, of course, and then what your step-by-step process is. The goal of chapter 3 is that I should be able to pick up your chapter 3 and run your study exactly how you envision it without ever having to ask you a question. So it's very, very specific and detailed. This is also a big piece of what IRB information, where your IRB information will be coming from when you apply for IRB approval. And so you've got to be very detailed so that they can approve the methodology. So first things first, you got to identify those variables. And those variables, based on the level of measurement, which we'll be talking about in this class, will help us determine what research design and also what appropriate statistical analysis you need to be using. You need to examine what your independent variables are and your dependent variables, and whether they're nominal, ordinal, or scaled, which is interval or ratio. It's also known as continuous numbers. That will determine the type of statistical analysis that you have to use in order to be able to analyze the data in the way you want to. There's also mediating variables. Mediating variables help explain why an independent variable has the effect it does on dependent variables, like effort related to confidence interval, right? You also have moderating variables, which influence the nature and strength of a relationship between an independent variable and a dependent variable. So maybe, maternal warmth versus income. Those things might mediate the negative impacts of income. Income doesn't influence maternal warmth, but maternal warmth does mediate the impact of class and income, potentially for individuals. Now, there are many types of quantitative research design. Descriptive is usually not robust enough for dissertation level work. But correlational, quasi-experimental, experimental, those are all feasible. Descriptive can be used in specific situations. Like I know that a former student at UC used looking at suicide rates and what had happened after the implementation of a suicide prevention program. And that was really descriptive, but it was also very robust and contributed to the research. And also, we can't really wait around to see if people kill themselves through suicide. So, the really only ethical way to look at that was through a post hoc analysis, kind of looking back at what had happened. So, sometimes ethics also kind of limit us on what we can do for reasonable reasons. Chapter 3 is taught where you're going to also talk about your sampling design. This is how you're going to get your sample. So there's a sample, which is the smaller representation of the population, and the sampling is the process you're going to use to get that sample. Now, do recommend that when you are thinking about your sample that you actually have a 2 or 3 tier strategy for sampling, no matter what type of research you're doing, because this is one of the big challenges for students is getting enough people for their samples. So really identify your sample, think about all the different ways you can get it, and propose a multi-tiered process for getting your sample so that you don't have to keep going back to IRB if you don't get enough people. We're also going to be talking about G-Power in the course, which is a great way to do power analysis and find out what sample size you need in order to achieve appropriate power and effect size. So, speaking of that, with our sample size, we want to make sure that we use a power of at least 0.8 and we have a significance level of at least 0.505 because we don't want to have more than a 5% chance that chance alone is impacting what we're doing. So we will be using G-Power. I've asked you to download that and we'll be playing with that a few times in class. Measures. Every variable has to have a measurement. So every variable has to have an instrument through which it's being measured. And ideally, you're going to present this in the order of dependent variables, followed by your independent variables. And ideally, they'll be in the same order as they are in your purpose statement, your research question, and your hypothesis. And technically, it's good practice to have your dependent variable before your independent variables. Though not always possible, doesn't always make sense. But for the most part, try to have your dependent variable ahead of your independent variables if you can. This is where you will also summarize the instrument's psychometric properties and evidence of validity and reliability. If it's an instrument that you're creating on your own, then you'll need to do either a pilot study or Delphi. These are done after you have conditional approval from IRB, and then they will then have you conduct that preliminary study and give them the information once you've done that, and then they'll give you full approval to move forward with the rest of the study. Data collection procedures. So we've said, okay, this is what we're going to use to collect our data. This is the design we're going to use. Here's who we're going to do. Now we're going to talk about how we're going to get the data. So there's two components to this, the procedures and the techniques. The procedures describe the way in which the data will be collected. Like, are you going to use an electronic survey instrument? Are you going to do interviews? Are you going to do paper and pencil survey? What are you doing? How are you doing it? The techniques is the way in which you'll record it. So is it going to go into an Excel spreadsheet? Is it going to be stored in a CSV spreadsheet and then converted to JASP and then all of that? So this is all about how you get the data. Most people will also include informed consent in this process about how they will secure informed consent from their participants. The data analysis is a big part of what we'll be focusing on in this class. And with data analysis, this is how are you going to analyze the data? So you've collected all of this information. Now what? One little caveat about collecting data. You only collect the data that's relevant to your study. Otherwise, it's known as phishing, Phishing. So we want to avoid phishing. So you really need to be very intentional about what you're collecting and also how you plan to analyze it. This is an important check for your methodologist and you because the level of measurement that your data is in is going to determine the type of analysis that you use. So if you have collected information that is, nominal, but you were planning on running a, like a Pearson correlation, that's going to be a problem because Pearson correlation requires that you have continuous variables, not nominal, right? And if you collected only continuous and you wanted to do ANOVA, how are you doing a nominal variable? Continuous is easier to go to nominal than nominal is to go to continuous, but you will have to think through those things and have an analysis plan for what you're going to do, how you're going to do it, what tools are you going to use. I also recommend that, especially if you're doing quantitative research, you need a statistician. You need to talk to your statistician when you're creating your proposal. You need to have your statistician go over your data with you, right? So this is worth its weight in gold. They don't do the work for you, but they're there to help advise you and consult with you, and also to check and recheck your work and help you think through things you might not have thought of on your own. This is an example of a data decision tree. We're going to be using some of these in class to help you determine what statistical analysis to use when. And then there's limitations of the methodology. Limitations, there are always limitations. So you've really got to think through what are the risks to internal validity. There's lots of them. And then what are the risks to external validity? So what would reduce my ability to generalize my results, and to whom can I generalize my results? Whereas internal validity is the things within the design of the study that maybe may have potential for weaknesses, problems, right? Like if you do a really long study, there might be maturation and attrition, and sometimes you have issues with instrumentation. So there's lots of threats to internal validity. So you want to kind of go through all of those and really think through which ones. And I think this is another area where it's really important to have conversations with your chair, with peers about your study, because you're so tied up into it. Sometimes you don't think through all the potential risk. And this is where peer review is so important. Another section in chapter 3 is the expected findings and ethical considerations. So based off what you knew from the literature, what are you expecting to find and why? And then what are the ethical considerations? Now, one thing that I really want to stress here is that ethical considerations must be tied to an ethical standard. It's only a moral issue if you're just saying, you should do no harm. But if you say, according to the ACA preamble, one of our obligations is to do no harm, as stated in the preamble, then that's an ethical standard that you've connected that to. So know the difference, right? It's very important to be able to tie it to an ethical standard for it to become an ethical consideration. It's also good to cover legal considerations. What are any legal considerations that might need to be taken into account? And then finally, what are your chapter 3 conclusions? You would summarize kind of what you've realized about the literature and or the way that you plan to study this. You're going to align it with the problem, and it's really a recap of everything you've done in chapter 3. Now, I'm going to pause there for a second because this is your proposal. When you first write your dissertation, you're going to write this proposal, which is chapter 1, chapter 2, and chapter 3. Those will be written, the chapter 3 especially, will be written in the future tense. It's going to talk about what you will do, like the purpose of this study will be to, da, 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 da. Once your study is approved, then you'll go through IRB and you'll conduct your study. While you're waiting for data to come in, waiting for IRB approval, you'll want to go back through your chapter 1, 2, and 3, and anything that was in the future tense, you'll convert to the past tense. So instead of the purpose of this study will be, you would say the purpose of this study was, or the purpose of the study was to examine, right? So it's past tense. So that is the first 3 chapters of your dissertation and how they are different between proposal and dissertation. All right. So now we're moving into chapter 4, which is the introduction, and it's when you've switched from proposal to dissertation. You've collected all your data, and now you're going to write about it. So just like every other chapter, you have to treat it like a standalone. So it's good to reintroduce the purpose, reintroduce what the study's about, and really orient the reader to what's about to happen in chapter 4. Restate any acronyms, restate your research hypothesis, and your questions. You're going to describe the sample. So this is where no matter what type of dissertation you're going to do, you have to use statistics to describe the sample so that people know to whom you can infer your results. If you're using quantitative, you're going to have sample size and power. You're going to talk about the demographic descriptions, APA, JARS, the Journal Article Reporting Standards, give some really great outlines for how and what information you should include. We'll be going over these in class a bit as well. And then talking about any discrepancies between what your original sample was and the sample that you ended up with due to attrition, due to data issues, things like that. So you have to explain all that. This is also a great opportunity that if there were any outliers, you would describe why and how you, or how did you treat those and why did you do what you did. Summary of the results and analysis. So summary is going to be an overall view, usually organized by research question or hypothesis. And then the analysis of the results is really going to be the data. Like, here's what we found, here's how we analyzed it, here's the results of that analysis. Going to be a great opportunity to have graphic representations of your data, tables, charts, figures. Then you're going to conclude chapter 4, and you're going to talk about, kind of the summary view of the results, not what it means yet. That's going to happen in chapter 5. And you're going to give some sort of transition into the results section, or into the discussion of the results section. So chapter 4 is really like this unbiased, objective perspective of the data. And now we're going to move into chapter 5. Chapter 5 is, again, new chapter, so you're going to give a description of the chapter, you're going to orient the reader to the chapter, the purpose, the research question, the hypothesis, any acronyms, and how the chapter is going to be organized. You're going to begin provide a summary of the results. What are the research problems, research purpose, the significance, what was the methodology used. So very concise summary of everything that's happened up to this point. The heart of the chapter is really the discussion of the results. Usually, again, this is organized by either hypothesis or research questions. So just be consistent. If you organized it by research question in chapter 4, you should organize chapter 5 in the same way. Likewise, if you use hypotheses, you should use hypotheses in chapter 5. This is where you're going to start to apply the literature to what you learned from your study and start to talk about the implications of that findings. What is the meaning behind your results? You're also going to talk about any limitations of the study, any design flaws, and any other problems you think that may have impacted the generalizability or validity of your results. With the discussion of conclusion, it's not the conclusion of the dissertation, but really conclusion of the results from your study. So you're going to compare and contrast to previous literature. You're going to look at how the study either affirms or disconfirms what we expected. And then this section is really starting to blend in existing literature. One of the things that you'll want to do while you're collecting data is to rerun your lit review. That's why you should always keep up with your keywords, your databases, and your previous search that you originally ran for chapters 2 and part of chapter 1, because you're going to want to rerun that literature review with the same keywords, the same databases, so that you can see if anything new has been published since you did your original literature review. That new research and the existing research you already had will be blended into the results of chapter 5 to talk about how it relates to what we know in the field beyond your study. So limitations is really looking at the limitations of the design, limitation of the results. Are there ways that you delimited your sample that might have resulted in issues? And then it sets the stage for the recommendation section, which is next. And this is where you're going to give recommendations for future study and also for practical applications. So really kind of how could you make your study better? How can your study be used for future practice? And what considerations should emerge from your study? Then you have a conclusion. You're going to sum up your whole dissertation. You'll restate kind of the answers to your research questions or hypotheses, and then really kind of lead into kind of what is next, right? What would be next for this particular topic? Here are the JARS reporting standards that I mentioned, the journal article reporting standards. We will be going over these in class again, but these are really great guidelines to help you know what to put in your reporting when you do report. There's also JARS for qualitative and mixed methods, so great resources to have. And here are my references, and I hope this presentation was helpful in orienting you to what a quantitative dissertation might look like.